Praising God again, this time for the lessons that we can learn even when we make a complete mess of things, understanding that seems to be the condition in which Judah finds itself in the second chapter of Lamentations that we want to call, What Will You Do When You Realize He Really Meant It? In this chapter that helps us understand how God really meant the promises he was making as Judah was descending into captivity by letting us know in the first 8 verses or so that he not only meant it, he brought judgment to them in his anger, reminiscent of the way that David was wise enough, even as a man after God's own heart, to pray for God not to discipline him in his anger, but in mercy. Judah gets it in anger, leading to verses 9 through 14 to let us know the effects or the results that it had on Jerusalem. Verses 15 and 16 showing us the effect or the awe that it inspired in the bystanders who witnessed the aftermath of what Jerusalem looked like afterward. Verses 17 through the end of the chapter, letting us know that God indeed meant it. Why? Because he has done what he purposed and promised. Verse 22, ending up in almost the exact same way the chapter started, saying not only did he do it, he approached them and disciplined them in his anger. Going in a little bit more detail though. Verses 1 through 8 break down a little bit more, like we said, in detail, I guess, with twice letting us know that he's disciplining them in his anger and in his wrath. It's going to say in verse 2. He has not apparently remembered that he considered Judah precious at one time. It seems as though, as it's going to say later on, that he actually considers them an enemy in the way that he has brought them down in dishonor, cut them down in verse 3, going beyond what he's personally done to say the way that he has, or to talk about the way in which he has removed his protection, basically inviting their enemies to join in their downfall. Going on to talk about, again, the things he has personally done, having bent his bow against them like an enemy in verse 4. Like a foe, it's going to say again before going on to before going on in verse 5, to say once again that he seems to have approached them as an enemy, no longer as a father. Verse 6, describing the way that he has laid the city to waste and in ruins. Verse 7, saying he has scorned his altar and delivered into the hand of the enemy the walls of her palaces, likening Jerusalem's downfall to a kind of twisted festival, something we will see again by the end of the chapter. And I think it has an additional significance too, what might be a helpful point to take away from this chapter. However, moving beyond the first 8 verses 9 through 14, talk about her gates, how they have sunk into the ground, the effect it's had on her kings and princes. Verse 11 goes on to talk about the effect it seems to have had on the altar, talking about how his eyes are spent with weeping. Beyond that, it's not just him. The infants are crying, verse 12, to their mothers, not simply for fear, they are faint for want, they are lacking. And in verse 13, he is going to say, what can I say? He is dumbfounded, because in verse 14, the prophets have seen for us, or seen for them, false and deceptive visions. Going back to a point I skipped in verse 9, where it basically says, the law is no more, there is no vision. That whole no vision thing being important, because part of being able to hope in a difficult circumstance has to do with being able to see beyond the despair that you might be in right now. They will find hope in the next chapter, but for now, they're realizing how vision is important to moving beyond a difficult situation. Verses 15 and 16, however, go on to talk about the response from those who witness as bystanders, apparently, saying, all who passed along the way, skipping to the end of verse 15, say, is this the city that was called the perfection of beauty and the joy of all the earth? Beyond that, within those bystanders seem to be their enemies, now able to rejoice at the fact that the evil they wanted to see happen to Jerusalem and Judah has now come to pass. Verses 17 on through the end of the chapter, reminding us again, I'll read it simply. The Lord has done what he purposed. He has carried out his word, which he commanded long ago. He is thrown down without pity. He has made the enemy rejoice over you and exalted the might of your foes. Verse 18 going on to say, their heart cried out in response to their condition. Verse 19 says, arise, cry out, seeming to say, don't be ashamed, don't hide it. There's some times when we need to just go ahead and let them tears flow, because it's a time for hopefully seeking some kind of mercy that would come through genuine contrition. That's my ad lib. But verse 20 goes on to say, look and see, with whom have you dealt thus? Should it really be this bad with the women and their children, the priest and the prophet? Verse 21 going on to say, in the dust of the streets, the young and the old, my young women and my young men have fallen by the sword. Reminding us, like we said, in much the same way the chapter started, in verse 22, the final verse, it will say, you summoned as if to a festival day my terrors on every side. And on the day of the anger of the Lord, no one escaped or survived. Those whom I held and raised, my enemy destroyed. Reminding me of that point that we talked about with regard to the festival day. Part of what seems to be so chilling about God's judgment on Judah and Jerusalem is the way he invited their enemies in to have a sort of twisted celebration at their downfall, bringing to mind this irony. The way in which much of Isaiah and Jeremiah were devoted to the way in which the people of Judah have begun to find joy in wrongdoing. The irony or the justice in God's response to them may be the way that he has now invited into their gates those who enjoy doing them wrong. Reminding me again of the wisdom in David's prayer. God, please do not deal with me in your hot anger. Understanding that that wasn't an idle prayer, because David's prayer for God's mercy was backed up in the life that David lived. And even though David committed some very serious wrongs, one of the things that seemed to be clear about his character is that he never gave himself over to finding joy in wronging others, which might have made the difference between God never completely abandoning David to his enemies and him giving Jerusalem over to those who enjoyed doing them wrong.